you can use law to protect the environment by creating strong legislation. And I've done some work that's been around strengthening legislation and making sure that there is good protection for the environment that's written into law. And then you can also use that law. So once you've got good laws available, then making sure that those laws are used, that you're challenging governments or challenging companies, and making sure that the protection that's in place is used to protect the environment is really important. So I think there's different ways that you can do it that's kind of constructive and also a bit more challenging. And then thinking about who you're protecting, whether it's protecting just the natural world or whether you're thinking about combining environmental work with human rights, which is a lot of the work I've done, where you're bringing in the people that are affected, the people that are well placed to protect the environment and protecting their rights as well as just the environment itself. It's definitely not an area of work that is without its challenges. And there have been quite a few times when I've really doubted my career, or doubted what the next job's going to be, or doubted what path I'm on. But I think there's power in law. And I think that lots of people can see that there is potential power in law, and using that power in a way that feels appropriate, that feels like you're actually using it for people that are not able to protect themselves, or for the environment that is not able to protect itself within our legal system, does feel like a career that I'm happy to be part of, or work that I'm happy to be doing, even if it's really challenging on a personal level and really challenging on a financial level. Lots of times it's definitely not the most lucrative area of law, but it feels like a good skill set to bring to the environmental sector. I think careers only really make sense in hindsight. So I think that whatever story I tell about, I did this and then I did that and then I did the other and that's where I am today, it kind of makes sense if I tell you in that sort of sequence. But at the time, it's never felt like that. It's never felt particularly clear. So I think to anybody that's further along, back along the path, trying to look forward and figure out what comes next, don't expect it to make sense looking forward, because it doesn't. So my experience was I did English, biology and chemistry at A-level, so kind of art sciences split, and then did archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge, and loved the, again, art sciences split and something that was quite practical, but then didn't want to stay in archaeology long term after that, so left Cambridge with that degree, and then went to work in charities in London for a year, and got a bit frustrated by the kind of roles that I was able to get as a graduate, but without any specific skill set that was useful to the charities sector. So I decided to follow a very well-trodden path of Cambridge graduate to go and do law, and was able to get a training contract to do that. So I got a training contract with a firm that did a very kind of broad base of different types of law. I deliberately avoided Magic Circle because I thought if I ended up going into the Magic Circle and earned loads and loads of money, I'd find it harder to leave. And I've seen quite a lot of people who have ended up going down that path and have found it harder to leave, because it's very alluring and it becomes a lifestyle and it's a different choice. So I chose a firm that enabled me to do some environmental law and some public sector law, and did the GDL and training contract, etc. And then as soon as I qualified, I left and found myself unemployed. So suddenly, like, qualified lawyer, no money at all, but stumbled across Client Earth. They had just started at that point, and they happened to be just down the road from where I was living. So I got in touch with them and kind of set up a meeting and explained that I was a qualified lawyer and I was just down the road and I was interested in some of their areas of work. And while I'd been doing the GDL, I'd been doing volunteering with Global Witness. And while I'd been doing the LPC, I'd been doing quite a lot of work with the Solicitors International Human Rights Group and led a couple of projects with them. And then while I was doing the training contract, I did some of a master's with the Open University around sustainability and environmental law, but hadn't got sort of experience of being an environmental lawyer, and didn't have a master's, but went along and got in touch with Client Earth and explained who I was, and they were happy for me to come and do some work with them. Initially voluntary, and then very quickly that became a paid role. And then that kind of turned into another paid role when the first contract finished. So I was there for a couple of years with Client Earth, And then various things happened and it felt like it was time to kind of go and do something else and think about leaving London. So I ended up working with the government legal service briefly, because you could get very flexible contracts with them, and that was interesting to see how the government's legal system works. And then went out to Southeast Asia with Earth Rights International, again initially unpaid, took a punt and went out there, and then that very quickly again turned into a paid role. And my husband Dan came out as well, and he did some work initially with them and then with other organisations locally. And they are an organisation that are not that well known in Europe, but much better known in the US, who've done lots of litigation in the US courts against oil companies for human rights abuses overseas. And they do a lot of work with local communities and providing training to local communities around environmental and human rights issues. And they, at the time, I started work with them in Chiang Mai, because that's where their main office in Southeast Asia was, but a lot of the work was focused on Myanmar. At the time, it suddenly sort of the situation in Myanmar was changing very rapidly, and it kind of became possible to open up an office in Myanmar. So I went across to Myanmar for Earth Rights and helped them set up an office in Myanmar in 2012-ish. And then helped set up a program there. So set up a program training some of the local lawyers on environmental law. They have no concept of environmental law or human rights, because it hasn't really served the Burmese regime to teach about rights or to teach about environmental law. So that was fascinating and really amazing people to be working with. And we were out there for a few years until I had my first daughter, and then we ended up coming back to the UK. And I haven't worked full-time since then, so I've done lots of part-time roles, but trying to juggle parenthood and work is a whole different ballgame. So the Oxfam role that I had with them was part-time, and that was working on a number of projects around how to engage lawyers outside Oxfam and use the legal community to support some of Oxfam's work, and also how to engage lawyers in a project called Lawyers Against Poverty, which is trying to kind of get lawyers to volunteer some of their time around specific projects, and also working with things like in-house lawyers, trying to get in-house lawyers to recognise that you can use your skills within your job to push for change, even, you know, without, you don't have to quit your work, you can kind of use your skills and your perspective within the role you've got. So that's taken me up to this last role that I'm in, well, sort of role that I'm in at the moment, when I then had my second daughter and the school strike movement started. So you'll note that none of that so far has mentioned climate change. I'd never worked on climate change until the work that I'm doing now, which was after my youngest daughter, who's now 2, was born. And then the IPCC report in 2018 came out, which painted a extremely gloomy, frankly terrifying picture of the state of climate change and the amount of time that we've got to actually take action on climate change. And that, plus a couple of other things, kind of spurred me to really engage on climate. I think for a long time I'd felt that climate was too big and too scary an issue, and I had to be an expert to engage around climate change. And I think that report and the school strike movement made me realise that actually I didn't have to be an expert. I could get involved as an activist, and all I had to do was care. And the fact that I had children and cared about their future was enough for me to engage around climate change. So I did, and just got stuck in as an activist, and went along to the school strikes in Oxford and got in touch with various groups who've been engaging and, you know, helping the youth strike movement. And helping to try and engage adults in that movement too, and quickly realised that there aren't many other lawyers in that work. And so I've also been trying to link up both the youth movement and the adult Parents for Future movement with lawyers and with kind of external support. My career path has been very wiggly, and there have been lots of times where I've kind of had to leap and not quite know what the next step is going to be. And I appreciate that that's not easy for everybody to do. I don't come from a massively wealthy family or anything, but I do appreciate the privilege I've had to be able to take risky choices financially, and that this career path can be really difficult if you haven't got those kind of financial safety nets. So I really appreciate the fact that I've been able to take some of those choices to to jump and not quite know what the next thing is. I think if you're able to trust yourself and trust that you will find the right thing next, that's great, but also not put pressure on yourself if you've got to make ends meet. I think figuring out how to trust yourself is really important. Figuring out that actually the things that feel deep down important to you, like I've always wanted to work on something that's related to the environment and something that feels like I'm able to use my voice in some way to speak up for people who are not able to speak up for themselves. And for me, the environment is one of those people, you know, the natural world in a wider sense. So find a way to kind of trust the bits that actually feel really important to you, that really kind of make you, I don't know, sing in some way, and find ways to do that work. And even if it's, you know, the bits that are not where you have to be super qualified. So a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment, and I call it work, even though it doesn't all pay. I work as a consultant, and some of what I do I get paid for, and a lot of what I do I don't get paid for, but it's still work. And a lot of it I don't have to be a lawyer to do it, but it still feels like it's important work to do. I think it is useful to have something that you're bringing to the charities kind of sector, but also I would say that experience counts for an enormous amount. So I don't think, and practical experience, I think law is quite a practical kind of skill or qualification, but I don't think that necessarily just having, you see some people kind of applying for jobs in the charities sector, certainly, who've got a lot more master's qualifications and master's level qualifications than I have. I don't have any master's levels qualifications. But I think that practical skills do count for a great deal. So if you're able to get some experience that feels like it would be kind of practically applicable, then that's really helpful, rather than just the theory. Theory is great too, and theory can definitely help you figure out what it is that you're interested in and which bits feel really relevant to you. But I think that practical skills are really valuable, and that's often reflected in recruitment when you're looking for roles or internships or whatever. People with kind of practical skills, and a bit tricky at the moment, but overseas experience and travel experience, so that kind of international cultural experience and appreciation of working with different groups is also really valuable. So I think that the main thing that still informs my climate work is the fact that I'm a parent, and the fact that I feel that kind of connection to the future that I feel through my kids. And I know that you don't have to just feel that through children, but that's a big factor that influences my work, or, you know, the ways I engage. Certainly kind of the other skills and the other experiences I've had of, you know, things like working with vulnerable communities is enormously important in climate change, because there are huge numbers of vulnerable communities. So being able to work sensitively with different groups is really important. So yeah, there's lots of ways that you can do things that are not climate labelled that are still useful in the climate space itself. But I think there's lots of ways that young people are raising their voice on climate issues right now, and so finding ways to connect with them and engage with them. I would really recommend the activists from within Fridays for Future and UKSCN, which is the UK Student Climate Network, kind of the UK equivalent of the School Strikes Network, have been so deeply inspiring. And just wonderful people to work with and really welcoming. So if you're interested in finding ways to engage in climate as a young person, I really recommend reaching out to them, and you can find all the groups are on any of the social media channels. And they're really welcoming at international level too. So if you're wanting to kind of get involved, then there's lots of scope there to engage and find out who's doing what and see about helping. And, you know, the ways that people are engaging are different at the moment because of COVID. Obviously, there's a lot less street protest, but protest is not the only way that you can engage. There's lots of other options too around different types of advocacy and different types of kind of engagement, and just talking about it. I think one of the most important things that we all need to do more around climate is talk about it and show that it's an issue that's important to us, and try and engage other people to think about it too. There's a great campaign called Teach the Future, which has come out of UKSCN. And yes, you know, networks in schools involving both students and parents, because lots of parents also care deeply about making sure that children are being taught about, not just about climate, but also about how to deal with climate, how to emotionally as much as practically, because it's a kind of psychological thing to deal with too, rather than just being overloaded with information about climate, sort of the forecasts. There's some really interesting work coming out of Wales, which I'm personally really enthusiastic about, where they have legislation about the well-being of future generations, and they've used that to reform their whole education curriculum, because they've realised that the education curriculum wasn't going to support children, young people, in the way that it is going to need to in light of climate change and other issues that are coming down the road.